Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this morning in this webinar, courtesy of the Center for the United States and Mexico at Rice University's Baker Institute. I very much appreciate your attention to this topic. As you well know, over the last few months, the security and public safety situation in Mexico has been deteriorating quite rapidly. The Mexican state has in fact employed a strategy towards organized crime that differs considerably from that of the previous two administrations. Even so, the situation has not gotten any better. So the coronavirus crisis that we are now facing in Mexico as well as in the United States has actually exposed some of the weaknesses of the current administration's strategy towards public safety and security in Mexico. And we thought it was time to examine some of the current trends and some of the aspects of the strategy of the López Obrador administration in Mexico today. And for that, we have invited two of our foremost experts at the Center for the United States and Mexico, Gary Hale, our non-resident fellow on public safety and security, and of course, Nathan P. Jones, who is one of our non-resident scholars on the same subject of public safety and security in Mexico. So the dynamics of this webinar, which will last roughly 1 hour, are the following. Gary and Nate will speak each for about 15 minutes, and then we will engage in a conversation. We, of course, invite your questions, and I will certainly pick the questions that I think are most pertinent from the screen and present them to our panelists this morning. So let's begin with Gary. Gary, the floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you, Tony, for the introduction. And good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is safe and avoiding the virus as much as we can do that. We're still locked down here in Katy, Texas, where I live, which is just outside of Houston, and trying to keep up with the world as it goes around while we're locked in. So this morning, I'm going to be discussing the impact of the coronavirus, or COVID-19 as it's being called, on the drug trafficking supply chain. Even though the focus is Mexico, obviously not all drugs are cultivated or produced in Mexico. In some cases they are, in other cases Mexico is just a pass-through. So I'll be mentioning some other countries as well. Second point is I'll be discussing COVID-19's effect on the people handling the supply chain, either at the source countries or inside Mexico itself. And thirdly, the COVID-19's effect on the demand side of the equation, how that demand side would be affected inside the US and on the US border. So the COVID-19, where is it? Where in the world is this happening? Well, it's just about, as we know, it's happening everywhere. How does COVID-19 impact the world of drug trafficking, especially in Mexico? To answer that question, I'm going to do a quick review of what we call the business cycle of drug trafficking. And this business cycle applies to whether you're making bicycles in China or drugs in Mexico. It's the same basic concept of how you make a product and take it to market, and then recapitalize the revenues. So the first part of the cycle is production. The second part is transportation. Once you produce the product, you have to transport it to market. So the second part is transportation. The third is distribution, is getting that product out onto the consumer market. And then after distribution, obviously you make money from the product and you recapitalize the enterprise. So that's a recap of the business enterprise. In the case of Mexico, we have two of those critical nodes, but we call them critical nodes, at play. And that is production and transportation. For production, that breaks down into two parts, and that is that some drugs come from a plant. Let's say opium, heroin comes from opium, cocaine comes from coca. So in the case of Mexico, you've got cultivation of opium, and the poppy, and marijuana. So the marijuana obviously is a raw product that ends up being sold as is. and the opium poppy is converted to heroin. So that's the part of the production cycle or the production part of the critical node in Mexico. The second one is the transportation. So that implies a couple of things. There are other things that are going on in Mexico having to do with drugs. Mexico is a pass-through for cocaine that is first of all, the coca is cultivated in Colombia and converted to cocaine hydrochloride or the powder, and it comes through generally Central America into Mexico and into the United States. Methamphetamine is produced in Mexico, but the raw product is ephedra. It's a plant from which the alkaloid is extracted, turned into ephedrine, and then the ephedrine is converted to methamphetamine. So those chemicals, the ephedrine comes from China. It comes from India, and it comes from Germany in its final product, in the ephedrine product. So those chemicals for methamphetamine come from China, India, and Germany, and they make their way to Mexico in ton quantities, are smuggled in, and then converted to methamphetamine, which comes into the U.S. So in that case, Mexico becomes both let's say, a manufacturer of the final product of methamphetamine and a pass-through because the chemical is coming from, let's say, China in that case, and then converted, and the final product goes into the United States. There are other synthetics, opioids such as fentanyl, that are also being produced in China, and they're making their way through Mexico. In one particular case, there is a fentanyl manufacturing factory in Wuhan, China, interestingly. So in either case, the critical nodes of production and transportation are within that cycle, within the production cycle that I mentioned, are affected in one of two ways, either because of the geography, where the chemicals, the raw products, or the final product comes from, and from the demographics. Who are the people that are involved in those activities, either production or transportation? So if you look at how the COVID-19 is affecting different countries, the demographics of this situation, some of the numbers are skewed because not all countries are providing accurate information. For example, China, which has probably got the largest population of the world, says that they have 83,910 cases and only 4,637 deaths, as compared to the United States, which is now about 1 million cases and 55,900 deaths. When you look at the source countries of Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru, Colombia has 4,500 reported cases, Peru 20,000, Bolivia 703. So those numbers go up and down. But these are the people, or these are the countries in which the people are operating, where some of these drugs are being cultivated and or converted. In this case, those countries that I mentioned is cocaine, where the coca is cultivated, converted to cocaine, and then sent forward to Central America. If you look at Central America, Honduras has 562, Guatemala 384, El Salvador 261, Belize 18, and Nicaragua 11 cases. And that was as of the 28th, as of yesterday. So the numbers are low, but the spread of the virus, as we know, is very prevalent, and infection can occur very easily. So even though we're not sure about those numbers, we do know that the virus is present and that the people, the populace of those nations are being affected. So what are some of the takeaways to this discussion with regards to the COVID-19 impact on the supply chain? Well, on the supply side, infection to or among traffickers due to contact with the drugs or packaging is less likely than person-to-person contact. My colleague Nate Jones is going to be speaking a little more in a more granular fashion about organizations, so he'll get to that. But just in general, the infection is more likely among person to person than it is due to contact with packaging or the actual drugs. For example, there's a research produced by the New England Journal of Medicine revealed that the coronavirus can live on plastic for 72 hours, on steel for 72 hours, on glass for 72 hours, cardboard for 24 hours, and copper for 4 hours. So, and then there's also an unknown factor, and that is the airborne contagion. The World Health Organization says that coughing or talking can spread it in areas without ventilation for hours, but that's not defined. So all those people that are involved in these activities, transportation or production, obviously can get infected. And if they do, then that will probably have an effect on their ability to fulfill their role in the business model. So despite the toll to human life that COVID-19 will take on any country, I believe the drugs will continue to move into the United States in sizable quantities. An example of that would be that on March 31st of this year, the San Diego Multi-Agency Task Force found a tunnel between Mexico and the United States, and they seized 1,300 pounds of cocaine, 86 pounds of meth, 17 pounds of heroin, 3,000 pounds of marijuana, and more than 2 pounds of fentanyl. So that the beat goes on, even though the virus is very active in Mexico and other source countries. Another point, despite lesser traffic, the U.S. Mexico border is still open to commercial travel and trade, and this provides a significant opportunity to traffickers moving drugs into the U.S. that are using that supply chain of commercial traffic. Another point, trafficker violence in Mexico will continue unabated, I believe, despite trafficker deaths caused by COVID-19. And this is partly because traffickers will likely not observe good hygiene practices other than makeshift masks, and that's just to cover their identity as opposed to for hygiene purposes. They will likely not observe stay-at-home orders. There will likely be an increase in crime by stealing medicines, medical supplies, and equipment at the retail and wholesale levels. And I do not believe that intra-cartel fighting among the cartels will not stop as COVID-19 provides opportunities to any one organization or another, as any one or another is negatively impacted by the loss of routes, the loss of contact with corrupt officials, and so forth. So, for example, on the weekend of the 18th of April, just a week or so ago, traffickers in Guerrero, Mexico, which state on the Pacific side, got into an hours-long battle. It's an area where heroin, where opium is cultivated and converted to heroin, and that left 13 dead. So the virus is really not affecting the supply side of the equation by COVID-19. On the demand side, I believe that COVID-19 will have a cyclical effect, which means that there will be ups and downs on the movement of people who make up the demand market, which means people who routinely, or generally, this is just a general statement, where does anybody go get their drugs at the retail level in the United States? Could be a bar, a restaurant, some kind of a outing. So the people who are involved in that, who frequent bars and restaurants, will continue to do that, but it's not going to, well, there's less people attending these public places and public events, but that will not stop the supply from reaching its customers. As a result, more clandestine sales on the street will occur instead of at public places. Drug prices at the retail or street level are already increasing. There's some DEA reporting about that, but those price hikes will be temporary, more than likely. Some of those price hikes are tied to increases in chemicals supplies to the manufacturers in Mexico and other places, depending on the drug. And other price hikes are tied to price manipulation of the drug traffickers who are taking advantage of the slower movement of the supply chain. So that concludes my remarks, and I'll be happy to take any questions when we get to that point. I invite my colleague Nathan Jones to follow on.
Nathan, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for being here. And I also want to thank all the people who helped me out when I was doing preliminary research in interviews for this. One of the people that I reached out to was Chris Kyle, Professor Chris Kyle, who runs the Guerrero Violence Project, which if anybody doesn't know about that, that's a wonderful gem of research on Guerrero. And as Gary mentioned, we're seeing a general continuity in drug violence, in particular related to large-scale clashes between Mexican drug trafficking organizations, as Gary pointed out. That is, certainly in terms of that, Gary and I are definitely on the same page. We're seeing a continuity of those types of large-scale clashes. And one of the other big trends that we've seen is what scholars like John Sullivan have talked about and applied to drug trafficking organizations in Mexico and other places is social banditry. A lot of these drug trafficking organizations or organized crime groups, because they've diversified so much, are engaging in social banditry. They want to be viewed as these types of Robin Hood characters. And so one of the things that they're doing is they're giving out food baskets, but they're doing it for social media presence. This isn't really a large scale food distribution plan in the areas where they are operating. We've seen the Sinaloa cartel do it, one of Chapo Guzman's daughters doing it. We've seen the Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación do it, so the CJNG. We've seen their rivals in the Michoacan area, the Viagras, doing this as well. And we've also seen the Gulf Cartel doing this. Why do they do this? There's been some great reporting out of Mexico that has pointed out they're not just doing it to weaken the state's legitimacy or to highlight the weakness of state institutions to provide these services. They're also doing it for the support of the local population, and in particular, this issue of being able to monitor their territories for other rivals and prevent rival encroachment upon their territories. And if they have the support of the local population, if they have more of these lookouts or halcones distributing food, giving them information, then they have a greater likelihood of being able to prevent rival encroachment. And that may be the biggest issue for them, is their continued conflicts with other groups. Now, one thing I want to point to is it's going to be very interesting to see which groups have the advantage. We're seeing in the legal world, you know, not the opposite of the underworld, the legal business world, that large scale corporations who have lots of capital reserve, they seem like they can ride this thing out. And will this apply to the Mexican underworld? That is a really good question. And I think that you're going to see certain groups that have that large scale capability to fund themselves, be able to survive this, but also they're going to be able to take advantage of the fragmentation within the Mexican underworld. So for example, the CJNG, Hector de Malion, an excellent columnist out of El Universal, has pointed out back in 2015, he might have written it in Nexos, that the CJNG has been particularly good at adopting the orphan cells. So when there's fragmentation as a result of the kingpin strategy, that fragmentation leaves these kind of cells orphaned. Well, the groups that have capital reserve and are particularly adept at flipping those groups into their organization have been able to expand very rapidly. And the CJNG has had kind of this special sauce to be able to do that. And that has led to a large scale expansion throughout Mexico over certainly the last decade, but in particular the last 5 years. And so they've come on very strong. Obviously, the Sinaloa cartel would also fall into that category of a larger scale group. Those are the big, top tier groups. In places like Guerrero, you have dozens of groups fighting it out town by town. And Guerrero is an interesting place to pay attention to. This all kind of fits together because on the one hand, you've got the port of Lázaro Cárdenas, which is incredibly lucrative. The CJ&G has a strong position there. Incredibly lucrative, but maybe it's not so lucrative right now because of the disruption of chemical precursors. So maybe it's not as lucrative right now, but it has been the part of the explanation for why the CJ&G may have so many capital reserves. Also, the CJ&G is very has the Los Queenies and the old Millennial Cartel, Valencia Cartel connections to money laundering. That's been one of the reasons why they've been very, very powerful. We've seen that from law enforcement interviews. So they may have more capital reserves. But if the chemical precursors are disrupted, so fentanyl chemical precursors, for example, are disrupted, then we could see black tar heroin taking and a good old-fashioned opium taking a bigger role. And what that would mean is that there might be an increase in the prices for the heroin markets or opium cultivation in Guerrero, and that means that those heroin markets might become more valuable and more worth fighting over. Now, it's interesting, in some of the other places that have been affected, well, the whole world has been affected by COVID-19, but in the favelas in Brazil, you saw these groups that control, these criminal groups that control the favelas, be some of the earliest to come in, pass out hand sanitizer, and enforce curfews. You didn't see that in Mexico until very recently. They were about a month behind in Mexico. And so that, we've started to see that increasingly in Guerrero. Chris Kyle pointed that out to me, and we've seen some more reporting on that, that these smaller local groups are enforcing the curfews now. We're also seeing, I did some interviews and I was particularly interested in what would happen, how would they adapt? How would these organized crime groups adapt to potential lockdowns? And we've seen a spike in, my interviews indicated that there was a spike in cybercrime. Now, whether or not this is directly connected to the existing organized crime groups, there are some linkages, but we're seeing an overall spike in cybercrime, DDoS attacks, which is kind of usually used as a distraction to get toward other types of attacks like phishing attacks. We're certainly seeing this here in the United States as well. And this is a broader societal vulnerability because more people are staying at home doing their banking transactions online, so there's more opportunities to target them. But also these criminal groups are, if they're potentially locked down, they're going to shift toward that type of a model. Now, we've also seen a bottoming out of the price of oil. And so, and this may be anecdotal, some of my interviews indicated that they have seen declines in, they weren't directly in the oil industry, but they have seen declines in some of their facilities that were near places of huachicoleo or oil theft. And so, and this may be anecdotal, but it was almost like when they saw that price drop dramatically, that there was less of that. So I don't know if it's anecdotal or if that's going to be a continuing trend. Also, with lockdowns and these larger corporations doing lockdowns, they may not, in certain industries, have their people out doing more exploration activities. Well, that means if they're not out doing those types of exploration activities, then they are far less likely to come in contact with organized crime. One of the big concerns that had been mentioned, and this kind of dovetails into exactly what Gary was talking about, is there's a concern about black market mafias getting involved in PPE or personal protective equipment, hand sanitizers, face masks. You're seeing dramatic price spikes and markups in those types of industries. You're also seeing a lot of potential for corruption in there. The aduana or the customs agents can check to see whether or not the permits were properly done, and that can be a source to do bribes or to ask for more corruption payments, essentially. You're seeing more checkpoints, primarily run by the government, depending on the area, but there are also organized crime checkpoints. And these can ostensibly be for okay, we're trying to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And so we're doing checkpoints to make sure people who are sick aren't moving, but also these can serve as checkpoints looking for bribes and things along those lines. So in terms of, well, I think what I'll end my comments there and open it up to questions, because I see a lot of questions coming up here. So I think I've done about my 15 minutes here, and I'll open it up to questions and pitch it back to Tony.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you very much. I do want to do kind of a rapid fire discussion of several of the issues that I had on the table, and also some of the questions that are coming in from the public. Can you, Gary and Nate, give me your assessment of the essential nuggets of the Lopez Obrador strategy? From the very beginning, Mr. Lopez Obrador essentially said, I am breaking away from the Calderon administration direct confrontation of organized crime, which was continued a little bit less visibly, but certainly continued under the Peña administration. And then he, of course, announced his strategy of abrazos no balazos, right? Hugs, not bullets. And so the Mexican state sort of retrenched a little bit from direct confrontation with organized crime. Is that working out, Nate?
Well, in terms of violence numbers, no. We're seeing the abrazos no balazos policy is not really working. AMLO wanted to establish the National Guard, and there was a hope that with this kind of gendarmerie type of force that it might set standards, and it might help to get everybody in Mexico on the same page in terms of security protocols. It's in the very early stages, so it's very hard to judge in that sense. By the same token, it's being asked to do many different missions. And because of that lack of focus on the sheer number of missions, I think that that's been particularly problematic. So maybe Gary has some thoughts on that as well.
Gary? I think your microphone is off. So if you turn it on, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
No strategy is no policy. So abrazos no balazos is really not a strategy, and it's definitely not a policy, even though that's the statement that the president of Mexico has chosen as his way of dealing with organized crime or public safety in general. The employment of the National Guard, the National Guard started with his predecessor, the Peña Nieto administration, and it was supposed to not supplant, but replace the military altogether. The military are an organization that is not generally equipped to do domestic law enforcement. It's a war-fighting entity, and therefore the idea was they shouldn't be on the streets performing law enforcement functions, which makes sense. So you develop a hybrid, which exists in many countries, which is a law enforcement entity that is militarily equipped and trained to take on the cartels. That was the idea, but that concept changed with the Lopez Obrador administration, because he started using them for everything or everything including, if you will. It turns out that the everything else took up more of the National Guard's time than combating organized crime. So it's been what I would characterize it as a failed effort. If the intent of the National Guard was to combat organized crime in place of the military, I don't believe that it succeeded. And the hands-off approach of the Obrador administration really is not doing anything but leaving the field open for traffickers to continue and increase their work. While the cat's away, the mouse will play. And the cat, in this case, being the military, which was the stronger of all the entities militarily to take on the cartels. So I believe it's a failed effort.
So let me follow up on the issue of the National Guard for a second, because I think it's important to take, as you mentioned, the National Guard and the military. I mean, both of them have been given tasks like the construction of the airport in Santa Lucia, the distribution of the cash transfers to Mr. López Obrador's political base, the public safety and security, and now they've been deputized to help with the coronavirus crisis, the pandemic that is now kind of ramping up in Mexico. That, as you mentioned, Gary, completely leaves the space open for organized crime and criminals and petty criminals and everybody else. So at the end of the day, when all is said and done, what do you guys see? What will the state of the military and what will the state of the National Guard be when this pandemic is over, with all these different projects, from construction to social welfare to organized crime to dealing with the pandemic? What will the state of the national security forces be in Mexico at the end of the day, Gary?
I think it's going to status quo. It'll remain as we see it today. The Mexican military sees their mission and legislatively as an internal control entity. It's there to protect the national sovereignty, national interests, but internally, not externally, like the United States does. The United States, it protects its interests from abroad, to keep the threats from coming into the United States, whereas Mexico does it from the inside out. They're just going to protect Mexico from within Mexico. So the need for increased military gear, training, equipment, and things of that nature is reduced and may not require any kind of increases other than to say state of the art, keep state of the art equipment in play, be on top of latest changes in technologies and training, things of that nature, just to stay competitive in this very complex world. The National Guard, that I think will, as we saw between the Peña Nieto and the López Obrador administrations, the change, and that is the change of the method by which they were employed, will depend on the political entity that is in power at the time, that has the seat of the presidency. Whether it's a conservative or a liberal government will dictate where and how the National Guard will be used. So I don't see much of a change now and until a new president is elected. If it's the same political party that has the same outlook, it'll remain the same. If it changes to a more conservative administration like before, then you might see a ramping up in the strength of the National Guard and a more focused mission on their part.
Nathan, let me add to that question a small nuance, because you wrote a book on the state response to organized crime. We are not talking about large cartels, except for the Jalisco Nueva Generación, of course, the Sinaloa, which are still there, and perhaps even stronger. But there are many, many other groups. Some estimate that there are 240, some 320, some 290, some on and on. And then even these cartels are now structured as sort of a confederation of cells that operate semi-autonomously and so on. So it kind of made sense to use the military or have a National Guard to confront large organizations like the cartels used to be. And now you have a mix. You have the large organizations, I mean, you have a lot of different cells and confederations and on and on. Is the Mexican security apparatus really equipped to face this new landscape, the way the criminal landscape has transformed itself over the last few years?
No. And it saddens me to say that, but the answer is no. And the primary issue is the weakness of local law enforcement. It makes sense to break up large criminal organizations as they can pose a challenge to the state, but that idea only makes sense in the context of, if you break them up into smaller groups, who's going to take care of the smaller groups? Those smaller groups have to be taken care of by local law enforcement. That's the inherent assumption based there. And so if local law enforcement hasn't dramatically improved, then you have a fundamental problem. And when you get these smaller groups, they're often disconnected from their drug source contacts. As a result, they have to diversify into increasingly predatory activities. When I was doing background research for this, I was having a conversation with another scholar, and we were looking at the groups in Guerrero, and he quipped, well, it can't get any more predatory. It's already gone as predatory as it can. So we can't really attribute more predation to COVID-19. The predatory nature of kidnapping and extortion, and these are primarily local level crimes, has gotten dramatically worse. Also, as scholars like Chris Kyle and others have pointed out, you've seen a flip in places like Guerrero, where it used to be that they were essentially trying to buy off the mayors. Well, now they're essentially slating the candidates, where they essentially, we had 145 politicians be killed in the run-up to the 2018 elections. You had 80 in one state alone, in the state of Chihuahua, quit because of death threats. At that point, you have to question in certain enclaves whether or not the candidates are effectively being slated by organized crime for the purposes of controlling local government so that they can control the appointments of police chiefs. And that's the fundamental issue. Now,
let me interrupt.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
To begin to sort of address some of these questions, because we have a lot of them coming in.
Okay.
But I think it's important. You mentioned that there's also the possibility that these different criminal groups, organized or non-organized, or very small groups, or opportunistic type of crime, are engaging in perhaps selling, monopolizing, stealing, and selling personal protective equipment. We've seen some of these incidents. Do you think that they will also engage in the business of fake medications and so on? We know that there's the possibility that there's a new drug. I think it's that was just announced this morning that may be promising. Do you think that these criminal groups at the very local level will also engage in this kind of dealing in fake treatments and protection from the COVID-19 crisis?
Absolutely. We've already seen this infiltrate illicit markets like alcohol markets in areas like Cancun and Quintana Roo, where you literally got fake or bad alcohol being sold. We have no reason to think that the pharmaceutical industry might not also be a victim of that, and every reason to think that that would be one of the places where, when they're disrupted, they need profits. This will be one of the places that they go.
I'll make a quick comment on that, Tony, if I could. Also, one thing to consider is that when the Zeta organization evolved from being a drug trafficking organization to a transnational criminal organization, they got involved in many other things beyond drugs. And one of those many things was pirated DVDs and CDs that they were bringing from different countries in Asia, Korea being one of them, and China being another. And they were bringing music and videos by the container load into Mexico. They were pirated. So it's very easy. They've got the contacts. Remember that they call them transnational criminal organizations precisely because they're involved in these kinds of activities. So adding some kind of drug that is maybe not does not have the adequate amount of the active ingredient is very easy for them to do.
Entirely conceivable. Gary, I have a question for you. As you mentioned some of the numbers in your presentation, cocaine at the seizure cocaines at the border are 50% down, meth 31.3%, heroin 16% down, fentanyl 8.5% down from February to March. Will that hurt the financial structure of the criminal groups? I mean, they obviously depend on liquidity, on cash.
Right.
That represent really their inability to function financially and pay off all the people they need to pay and buy the products and move them on and so on. What do you see in the finance?
I don't think so. I don't think that liquidity will be affected by either a temporary lowering of prices at the retail level, and or an increase in seizures, and or a stoppage or delay in the supply chain. And all of those things combined, I think, are just temporary, and I don't think it'll impact on the bottom dollar. And the reason is because of what I just mentioned. At one time in the evolution of drug trafficking in Mexico, when those organizations were drug trafficking organizations, let's say they specialized in marijuana or specialized in heroin or whatever it may be, the prevailing thought in those days, I'm talking about 2 decades ago, during that time, was that marijuana was the cash crop that would sustain liquidity. If they lost money because they were, the heroin market was going down, there was, or it was being supplanted by methamphetamine, whatever, marijuana would supplant that to sustain liquidity. That all has changed, and that has changed because these organizations have evolved, and they have many, beyond multiple business lines: prostitution, extortion, utilities, alcohol sales that Nathan mentioned. You name it. It just goes on and on and on and on in terms of the different lines of business that they're involved in. And those serve to maintain the liquidity of any of these organizations that are involved in that. So drugs by itself is not going to affect the liquidity of a well-organized criminal organization.
So, Nate, is this state failure, government failure, or strategic failure? How would you qualify the fact that crime in Mexico is more extended, more diverse? There are many more groups. Are we approaching that, that idea that, it's beginning to look a little bit more like a state failure, or are we talking simply about government failure, or even just a strategic failure, strategy failure?
Well, yeah, I'm always reticent to say, state failure. I like the term Jonathan Rosen talks about, and others have talked about, state fragility or weak states, because to give it a little bit more nuance. But certainly there are individual, there are local level government failures in terms of, just as there are, market failures, and any economist worth his salt will acknowledge market failures in certain places. There are certain local government failures. And, that's acute in particular regions of Mexico, and more acute in particular regions of Mexico. I would point to Guerrero as being one of the places where it's a lot more acute.
We have a question about frustrating money laundering, and let me add to that question a little bit. The López Obrador administration has put its faith on financial intelligence as an important instrument to fight not just corruption, but organized crime. And they carefully target it. Recently, The Economist had an article in which they argued that Latin America was discovering this tool, financial intelligence, to fight corruption and perhaps organized crime, even though it also argued that in Latin America, it is getting dangerously political, that it's a tool that can be used against political enemies, to investigate political enemies, to freeze their assets and so on, and to sort of disable them politically. Do you think that the financial intelligence strategy in Mexico is working? Do you think that it's promising, or is it just completely overwhelmed and surpassed by the reality on the ground? Nate, and then Gary.
Okay, well, successful financial intelligence prosecutions are going to be just that, prosecutions. And that's going to depend upon the legal and judicial system. And one of the things that we've seen is the legal reform has only recently been fully implemented, and you have a situation where it has very high standards, and the investigators oftentimes maybe aren't necessarily trained to those standards. And so you have situations where people or major traffickers are getting out. I can point to specific examples. Major traffickers are being released because of due process issues. So in terms of financial intelligence, I think it's a great thing. I think it's something that should be expanded on. There should be lots of cooperation in terms of extradition and joint prosecutions with the United States. But fundamentally, this is going to come back to the success of the judicial reforms.
Gary, to add to that question, as you answer or as you add to this response, let me add: is there any way to save the Merit Initiative? Does it need to be scrapped in favor of a different strategy? Do we need to add to it to change it in some way? What do you think about that? that's another question that is coming in from.
Sure. Let me start with, or let me finish up the money laundering
Yes.
question here real quick. Money laundering is almost a thing of the past. In the 1990s, DEA did a lot of money laundering investigations undercover. Most of the money in those days was going back to Colombia. So there was a lot of undercover infiltration, very complex, very difficult investigations. You had to have the Attorney General's approval. There was some corruption where DEA agents were stealing money from the traffickers. But at the end of the day, it was successful because we seized a lot of properties, a lot of assets that the traffickers had in the United States, a lot of cash. That was then. That was the 90s. Now, money laundering, think of the words, laundering of money, is almost a thing of the past because of those successes, traffickers around the world that are bringing their product and into the United States and taking the money out, realized that we were being successful. So they started doing what? Smuggling cash. So most of the money, the proceeds of drug sales is cash transfers being smuggled in reverse back to Mexico. So that's one. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is another manner by which money is being in the general category of being laundered. This is where the money is going to being invested and kind of going into a black market. And then the third one is the involvement of China. Since China is involved in the overall, in a very large way in the supply chain through Mexico, then Mexican traffickers have a great opportunity to invest in China, and therefore you're away from the eyes of the United States and away from the long arm of the law that the United States used to seize monies back in the 90s when it was traditional money laundering. So all of these things, smuggling of cash, Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and the involvement of China have made money laundering a thing of the past, I believe. With regards to the Merida Initiative, when I was there in 2012 and 2013 as the program manager for law enforcement and intelligence program of the Merida Initiative, it was a $1.6 billion enterprise, and it was an agreement between Presidents Calderon and Bush, and the whole mission was to allow 5 different entities: the Army, the Navy, the CSEN, the intelligence agency, the PGR at the time, which was the Department of Justice equivalent, and the National Police, those 5 entities, to improve their institutions by training, equipment, and so forth. So we had this money broken down into different categories, and we gave as much as possible in those areas, equipment and training, to Mexico, with very little accountability. Why? Because the equipment and training, the things that we gave were gifts, they were grants. Once they were given to Mexico, who cares? And as a matter of fact, there was a very soft audit that was conducted about 2 years into the program. I remember there was several hundred, 300-400 trucks, F-150 type vehicles that were given to the police. A couple of years later, just a general question. It was not an audit, it was just a general question: where are those vehicles? And nobody could account for the vehicles. So who knows where they went? The bigger ticket items, I think there was 6 Black Hawk helicopters that were given to the Navy and to the federal police. Of course, they're very obvious and they were flying in the skies all the time, so easy to see. So the problem that I see just in general with the Merida Initiative was that there was no accountability. Of course, you have to provide the benefit of the doubt to the nation that you're assisting. But the whole idea is institution building. And the other part of this equation is that you have to have a willing partner. There has to be political will on the part of the government that you're helping to increase their capabilities. So as long as there's political will on the receiving end, then do I support another Merida Initiative program? Absolutely. I would add some measure of accountability to ensure that the equipment, training, and other things that are provided are actually used for the intended purpose, so that we can help improve the capabilities of whatever host nation it may be. There are similar programs. The one of great success occurred in Colombia, and there are other smaller similar programs throughout the world that the U.S. State Department is managing in conjunction with the other entities in the U.S. Embassy, the stakeholders, DEA, FBI, Customs, Border Patrol, whoever it may be that's involved in those activities. So is it a good thing? Absolutely a good thing. Should we do it again? Yes. I believe that it never hurts to try to help your partner nations improve their capabilities, especially when we have combined or joint interests in whatever the problem set is, and in this case, with public safety and reducing the flow of drugs into the United States.
So let me then now turn the question on its head as well, because I think we ought to look at Mexico City, but we also have to take a look at Washington, D.C. I asked the question about whether this was a state failure, I guess a government failure, or a strategy failure. What's failing in Washington, D.C.? What is Washington, D.C. doing wrong vis-a-vis Mexico? Where are the 2-3 failures in Washington, D.C. in this regard?
Let me add, provide a quick answer before Nate gives his response. I believe our failure is political, and what that means is that we do not have continuity of operations. And I was with DEA for 31 years. I worked in 3 different Latin American countries, and our failure as a government of the United States was lack of continuity, which means that just like in the case of the National Guard in Mexico, that it was a certain concept by Peña Nieto, and that concept was changed by López Obrador. That is a lack of continuity. The same thing we have suffered from, we the United States, and that is that when I was in Bolivia, I was there for a period of time where we had 2 different administrations. And in one administration, they were more conservative, and another administration was more liberal. So when you have liberal U.S. government administrations, they tend to focus on the demand side. When you have conservative political administrations in power in Washington, they focus on the supply side. You know, where does the drug come from, and work with those host nations to reduce the supply of the drug coming to the United States. So as those administrations, as we change our political parties, and at this point we're a bicameral party, we have the Republicans and Democrats, that's about it. So, and one identifies with the left or the liberals, and the other one identifies with the right or the conservatives. And as they change, and you know, the pendulum swings practically every 8 years in our country. So every 8 years, we have a change in policies, either to the conservative side or to the liberal side. That hurts our ability to function in these drug control policies throughout the world.
Yeah, Nate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I agree with Gary. It's a political question. We've put incredible pressure, the Trump administration put incredible pressure on the Mexican government in terms of migration policy, sometimes to the detriment of organized crime policy. And so that shift in focus, where you have very few resources, is problematic. If we look at Mexico at a macro level, 16% of GDP is raised in taxation in a normal year. Obviously, that's going to take a big hit. By contrast, the United States is 26% of GDP, and most OECD countries are between 34 and 38%. So the United States is actually kind of low on average. Mexico, though, is particularly low in terms of its intake in terms of taxation, and that has spin-off implications in terms of salaries for law enforcement, ability to provide for the security apparatus, ability to provide for the court systems, and governance at all levels.
Let me return a little bit to the Mexican side. After this COVID-19, we've seen in the United States a loss of 27 million jobs, and we're not sure if that number is going to go up this week and so on. We're still in the middle of the pandemic. And in Mexico, there's also already hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, in addition to the fact that the informal economy, the so-called informal economy, is about 55 to 57% of the country. And that, of course, leaves many, many different people in Mexico in a very precarious situation. And that may obviously entice a lot of opportunistic crime, petty theft, and I mean, people have to go out there and earn a living, and of course, some of them will do it by delinquency, acts of crime. Do you foresee that in Mexico, the situation on the ground, on the day-to-day, hour-to-hour, block-to-block in cities will simply just get worse when unemployment really begins to hit a record? We just found out that the economy in Mexico in the first quarter contracted by, I think, 2.5, 2.8%, in the United States by 4 point some percent. So clearly there's going to be a crunch for people to put food on the table. Can we expect that to translate into greater criminal activity in the streets?
Go, right?
I would say yes. So it also depends on the timeline. And that's one of the issues that keeps coming up. Short term, you might expect, okay, everybody kind of quarantines, everybody goes in their house, but we haven't really seen a decline in violence. We've seen homicides continue on in Guerrero, 4.4 per day, 4.8 per day, somewhere in there. On a national level, it seems to be continuing on and marching on. But if this continues longer, we might expect increases as people become more desperate. As people become more desperate, they may take out more loans. Who are they going to get those loans from? And will they become indebted to organized crime? That is a common mechanism by which organized crime engages in forced recruitment. You owe someone money, or there's some perceived debt. You have to pay off that debt. How are you going to pay off that debt? Well, you work for us now.
Right. Gary?
The COVID-19 does not respect borders, like the governor of California said. It doesn't take weekends off. It affects everybody all the time. In the case, a quick case study in Venezuela, the ELN recently said that they wanted to come to the bargaining table to sue for peace, and there was questions about why. And one of the reasons, just a logical explanation, would be that they're losing a lot of war fighters and they're weakening in their ability to fight. So therefore, hey, let's go to the peace table. The same thing applies in Mexico. The COVID-19 affects everybody. It's going to affect the drug traffickers' numbers of people involved in all of those aspects of the business cycle, and they're going to need more people to continue to perform those functions. So what do you get? You have a ready crop of young people, or any people, who are looking for jobs because they're unemployed because of the virus to begin with. So there's a available crop of people to fulfill those roles that would otherwise be filled from victims to COVID-19.
So we have a couple of minutes left, so I want to put the last question out there for you, a minute or two each. And then we'll conclude. At the end of this, when the COVID-19 crisis is done in Mexico, what will the country look like? What will the criminal landscape look like? What will the government, in its ability to really grapple with organized crime, look like? What can we expect? And I'm asking you, obviously, to forecast a little bit, to do a little bit of a strategic foresight, and sort of think a little bit through. And tell us what companies, investors, citizens, just small businesses and regular people can expect. Gary? Yeah,
I think that it's going to be worse rather than better in terms of the strength and the activities of criminal organizations. Criminal organizations don't follow rules. They don't have the same bureaucratic limitations that governments do. They function more easily. If you don't agree, get rid of the person who doesn't agree. So they are very fluid in terms of their ability to adapt. Governments are not. The government in Mexico is having a hard time meeting the public health and equipment demands that COVID-19 has brought on. I think they're going to suffer greatly, as much as the United States has already suffered, probably, and maybe even worse, which leaves opportunities for organized crime to fill the voids in governance. Why do we have this last clash that we just talked about in Guerrero last weekend? That was actually a clash between traffickers and the autodefensas. These are citizens groups that have decided to defend themselves because the government can't do it. There's going to be more of that. Autodefensas autodefensas came to life because the government could not provide public safety. There's going to be more of that because the government is going to be focused on public health issues and less on public safety, and that provides an opportunity for criminal organizations to fill the void and to grow. And when that happens, the landscape, I think, will change. At the end of the day, whenever that, whenever we say COVID-19 is, has flattened out in Mexico or wherever else in the world.
What does your crystal ball say?
Okay, yeah. So at the end of this, I agree with Gary. I think we're going to be in a slightly worse position. Earlier, he talked about status quo. I think we're seeing continuation of trends, so status quo, but slightly worse. And so in terms of organized crime versus the state, I think that there's going to be more organized crime in aggregate versus kind of state rule and control. There's going to be more economic activity from organized crime. I do think we will see some consolidation in the criminal market in the sense of large groups like the Sinaloa Cartel and the CJNG may be able to establish more relationships, buy off local criminal cells, or provide drugs to local criminal cells. But a lot of those local criminal cells are going to continue to be self-funded, and they are very interested in recruitment and forced recruitment because they're very worried about all the rivals around them. So they're probably going to be able to get more recruits, have more recruits on their payroll, but that means you have to meet that payroll. And that means that if that payroll isn't being met through larger drug sales, that payroll will have to be met through smaller predatory activities like kidnapping, extortion. So I think we're going to see a broader expansion of that. We're also going to see a broader expansion of people with informal debts to organized crime, which allows organized crime to interpenetrate the economy more, have more access to corruption. If law enforcement have debts to organized crime, that allows them to further interpenetrate the state.
And I should say that that's an expansion of what's already happening with human smuggling, where the coyote networks are going into Central America and offering to move people through Mexico to the United States in a migrant fashion. But as payment, they take properties, deeds to properties, loans, and things of that nature in order to, to be able to pay for the service of transporting the migrant. So that's already happening. It's just going to expand into other areas.
I think at the end of the day, what is interesting here is that the COVID-19 crisis is allowing us to see the weaknesses in the current strategy in both Mexico City and Washington, D.C., and the fact that these two countries are not working together on these issues. It's generally the agenda from Washington on Mexico, and of course, the Mexican government's a rather questionable response to organized crime. And this is allowing us to go back to the drawing board and reconfigure the way that the country is going to deal with organized crime, or as you said, governance in Mexico will become increasingly difficult, and the government will at some point be simply surpassed or overpassed by criminal activities in the country, and it will be more difficult to get on top of that. I hope that these reflections are of use to you. Thank you very much for paying attention to us. We'll continue to deal with these issues over time and keeping an eye on what is going on in Mexico in terms of organized crime. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Gary, for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.